Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Wolf, and I'm the programming coordinator here at the Osterville Village Library. Thank you for joining us today on this rainy Saturday. And to our friends joining us on Zoom, thank you for being here as well. Today, we have the honor of introducing Olivia Padula, Curator of Collections at the Sandwich Glass Museum. She'll be sharing the story of the Boston and Sandwich Glass Company and how the glass industry shaped and continues to shape the local economy. Founded in 1825 by Deming Jarves, did I say that right?
Yep.
The Boston and Sandwich Glass Company industrialized the oldest town on Cape Cod and brought a rich artistic tradition to the area that still thrives today. Without further ado, Olivia Padula.
Well, thank you guys all for having me today and joining me. As you can see from the title, this is 200 years of glass making and sandwich. Is that good? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's just for the folks at home.
Wonderful. So this year we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the glass industry in Sandwich. All right. So this lovely gentleman over here is Deming Jarves, as Amy just introduced him. He's the founder of the company. Excuse me. So Deming Jarves was born in Boston in 1790, and he was a pretty prolific and wealthy businessman.
Oh, the thing on top.
Maybe bring it to the bottom.
There.
Wonderful. All right. Now we're in business. All right. So by 1812, so he was around young 20s, he had already started a couple of businesses. He had an import-export business, a dry goods business, all up in Boston. And a little closer to the 1820s, he started getting involved in a few glass companies. So there was the Crown Bottle Glass Company in Boston. There was the New England Glass Company. So he was very familiar with the industry and the trade and the growing need for glass in the United States. And this here is a drawing from his book Reminiscences of Glassmaking, and that shows the interior of a factory at the time. And so you can see that there's a lot of chimneys, so you could have a bunch of men working at once. All right. So after the death of his father, he inherits a nice sum of cash, and he decides to invest in his very own glass company, and he decides to bring it to the Cape. So this is an image of what the factory might have looked like at its very beginning. The first gather of glass, so the first piece made, was actually made on July 4th, 1825. So we're going to be having a big celebration for that. So what he started was the Sandwich Glass Manufactory, and that's this building here. And that started in 1825. Eventually, actually, I'll go back. Eventually, the businesses that he was still involved in Boston and this new venture in Sandwich were too much to handle, so he combined them into one, and that's how it became the Boston and Sandwich Glass Factory, with the actual factory site in Sandwich and a lot of the offices and the shipping stations out in Boston. All right, so a lot of people wonder, why did he come to Sandwich? And one of the main reasons, as you can see in this lovely old-timey photograph here, is the local availability of timber. So before the glass industry came to Sandwich, it was a very, very agricultural town, and their main export was timber, which they would ship off to England most times. And they used in the factory the timber as the fuel source to power the furnaces. So in this industrial setting, you have your furnaces going 24/7. Back then, if you shut the furnaces down, it would take about 2 weeks for them to fully cool, and then another 2 weeks to heat back up. And so, you know, if you're doing production, that's quite a delay. So they would have these going constantly, and they used a lot of fuel. Another question people ask is, did they come to Sandwich because of the sand? And unfortunately, that is not the case. As you can see in this larger jar here, that's what beach sand looks like. And when it melts down, it's very impure. There's a lot of junk in it, I'll call it. And then in this higher up jar, that's more pure silica, and that's what they would use in their glass formula. So they did have to import the silica. First, they were coming from New Jersey, and then they found a source, the Berkshire Mountains in Western Massachusetts. So that's where they got their sand. And another reason that Deming Jarves chose the Cape was because he was already pretty familiar with the area from hunting and fishing trips. As it is still today, it was a popular pastime for businessmen from Boston to go to the Cape and vacation and break away from the city life. And at this time, the Industrial Revolution is going, and Deming thought he could entice factory workers from the city to move to the more idyllic Cape setting. So I just like that painting. It's hanging in the museum, and it shows the nice country living. And that was very successful. He was able to entice a lot of workers from Boston to come to the new factory, as well as a lot of English and Irish immigrant workers. They came over. So the English and Irish were thought to be the foremost craftsmen of glassmaking at the time. And again, when you're starting a company, you need these people who are already established in the field, because it's about a 7 to 10 year apprenticeship to become a master glass blower. So training your new staff for 7 to 10 years can definitely put a damper on things. So this is a photo, a later photo of some of the glass workers in the factory, but you can see them here using their tools and hand blowing everything. They're making some stemmed ware. And this piece over here is one of my favorite in the museum. So some of the first factory workers were the Haynes brothers. It was Edward and Benjamin. And let's see. Edward was what they called a leg man. And so he was the one who added the stemware to the glass. And this is what we call his interview piece. So Deming Jarves brings him over from England, and he says, all right, show me what you can do. So Edward adds a little foot, and then another little foot, and another one, until eventually Deming Jarves says, I get the picture, you're good, you're hired. All right, and then this is another photo from their display. I just like to show it. It's a fly trap. So you'd add like water or juice to the bottom, and the flies would go in and get trapped and leave your kitchen. So you can kind of see behind there that there's a wooden tool. So it's this, but it has wooden spokes. So these are the tools that they use. And if you ever come to the museum and get to watch our glass blowing demonstrations, which we have every hour on the hour, you can see that they'll be using the very same tools that were developed thousands of years ago. So the craft has not changed much over the years. And we like to say that if we took a factory worker from the 1800s and we dropped him in our studio, he'd still know his way around and be able to make something easy peasy. So all the very first goods that the factory made in Sandwich were free blown. And so, that might be something like this fly trap. But, and then there we go. Here's some more examples of their earliest goods. So these were very labor intensive products because everything was hand tooled by the artisans. And it would take a team of like 3 to 5 men, upwards of 15 minutes to make a single product. So that definitely drove up the cost. These were not inexpensive goods. So these vases over here are called hyacinth vases. You'd have the little bulb sitting on top, and the roots would go in the water so it didn't rot. The piece in the middle with the little girls in there is called a whimsy. And so that's something that the glassmakers would make, during their time off or after their shift. And they were usually made as just gifts for friends and family and to show off their skill. This jar looking thing is a sugar bowl, and that's called beehive glassware, and it's thought to mimic English and Irish silver that was coming over at the time. And so all those lines are hand tooled in with those pinchy tools that I had pointed out earlier. They're called jacks. So you can imagine it's tedious and labor intensive, and especially this coin bank that's on the very end. That's one of the coolest pieces I would say we have. So that's all, hand tooled, hand blown. And we've got a couple in the museum collection, but actually not a lot still remain, because what happens when you fill your piggy bank? You got to break it to get the contents out. And so that's what they would do. And then, you'd ask your dad to go back to the factory and make you a new one. So we are fortunate to have some surviving examples, but there's not a whole lot. All right, so Deming Jarves, being the business savvy man that he was, he saw with the Industrial Revolution, there's the growing middle class, and he wanted to make glassware that would appeal to that market. And to do that, he needed to find a way to introduce some more unskilled labor to the factory and to cut down on time making pieces. So his first venture into this mass production was mold blown glassware, and that's what you see in these bottles here. So the metal thing on the far, my right, but your left, is a example of what the mold blown mold would look like. So it's a 3 or 4 part hinged mold that your assistant would come over, he'd close it up, and you would gather some glass on the end of a blowpipe. When you stick it down in the mold and you blow out, the glass would expand like a bubble and take the shape of whatever bottle was carved in there. And then your little assistant, usually a teenage boy who was an apprentice, would come over, pop it out, and voila, you have a mostly formed bottle. What they would do after the bottle was blown, the blowpipe would still be attached up at the top. So they'd transfer it to what was called a punty rod. It's just another blowpipe. And then they would be able to kind of hand tool the top of the piece and finish it how they wanted to. And this was important because getting these molds made was a very expensive process. So they were very creative with how they used them. So if you see this bottle here, that is the same mold, or it could have been the same mold as the cup, but then they would have cut the top off the cup. And there you have it. Or the pitcher, if you flare it out and add a handle, it becomes a pitcher. So they used the hot tools to expand their line of production without having to make a whole bunch of new molds. And they were making these wares around the 1830s to the 1840s. So in 1825, separate from our glass factory, a gentleman named John P. Bakewell invented the American glass press, and I've got a figure of that there. And that was a major invention for the industry because it allowed you to very quickly and cheaply produce glasswares. And this was great for Deming because it's about a 2-week training process to learn how to use the glass press. So he was able to add a lot to the workforce, especially people local to Sandwich. And so this over here is an example. It's a very zoomed in example of the first products they made. And it's today it's called lacy glass. It's just a collector's term. But it's called lacy glass because of all this intricate detail that reminds collectors of old bits and pieces of lace. But the stippling detail and the very over-the-top decoration was a very intentional way for them to distract from any defects that were in the glass. So I've zoomed in a lot so you can see some bubbles. You might see a line up there, which could be a tool mark or a cooling mark. But a lot of these defects came about from the mold itself being the improper temperature. So if it's too cold, it would kind of screw up the process because the glass was about 2,200 degrees. But that worked very well for them. Could hide any imperfections, and they did. So this is just a close-up of what a mold, a glass press mold might look like. So you pull a lever and then kind of see it all the way up at the top. That's the plunger, and that would come down and form the inside. This is a very special piece. It's the Lafayette boat salt. So it's a little table salt that you'd have. You could have a couple on the table to add a little pinch of salt to your food. But what's special about this is oftentimes people will ask, how do I know if I have sandwich glass? Is there a maker's mark? Did they sign their wares? You know, how can you tell? And unfortunately, they did not sign any of their wares. You know, they didn't think 200 years later that we'd have a whole museum dedicated to the stuff that they made, and there'd be collectors, and I'd be here giving you a presentation about sandwich glass. You know, it wasn't a thing for them. So this is special because it is the only piece that they ever signed. So in the bottom of the boat, it's pressed sandwich, and on the back, I apologize, I flipped the image, but it does say B&S Glass Co. And the reason that these are signed is they were commemorative pieces made for the launching of the Lafayette steamboat in Boston. And they could sometimes be filled with candy and sold or given out on the steamboat as like fun little souvenirs. And so this is more examples of the lacy glassware that they made. We've got some table salts in the front. There's a creamer, a sugar bowl, a plate. So they made mostly just tableware, everyday items that could be quickly made and sold. All right, so now, you know, we've got this wonderful new invention that really cuts down on time and cost, and you can introduce these unskilled laborers. But there comes the problem of the glass blowers, right? They are some of the highest paid individuals of their time, the most skilled ones. And so Deming Jarves wrote in his book, The Reminiscences of Glassmaking, that after he introduced the press, he was afraid to enter the factory workers' village for like 6 weeks for fear of getting beat up by the glass workers in retaliation. You know, they thought they were going to be out of a job. But as you can see in this lovely display of objects, all the bases of these pieces are pressed and all the tops are free blown. So they didn't get rid of the glass blowers. They were still very involved, and they could kind of work together with the press to cut down on time and cost, but also add these hand-blown elements to retain that nice handmade quality. So he did not get beat up. It was all right. And then one of the most popular products they made were cup plates. I gave this presentation to the boat club a couple of weeks ago, so I picked 2 boat-themed cup plates. But does anyone here know what a cup plate is or what it was used for? No, so I'm sure you see them everywhere if you go into a thrift store on the Cape. I know I do. We've got like 800 of them at the museum. But anyways, so I describe it as the modern predecessor to like a teacup and saucer. So the way that the Victorians drank their tea was a very weird process. They had a handleless teacup that they would pour their tea into. But of course, the tea was too hot and it took too long to cool down. And the cup itself, it didn't have a handle, so it was too hot to pick up. So they would pour from the teacup, they would pour the tea into a shallow bowl where it would cool down much faster, and they would drink it directly from there. But now you're left with the problem of a dripping handleless teacup, and you don't want to ruin your linens because you can't just throw it in the machine, right? They didn't have those. So you'd put it on a cup plate, and that would, yeah, I see, yeah, it was a very roundabout way of drinking tea. Obviously, that did not stay in style for very long. They were producing the cup plates from like 1825 up until the 1830s, towards the 40s. But they very quickly became commemorative things. So this is the Chancellor Livingston on the left, your left. And that's the boat that came and greeted the Cadmus, which was bringing Lafayette to America. So they were made to commemorate events like this. They had monuments, they had people's faces on them, and they were collectible things as they are still today. But they made a ton of them because they were the easiest and quickest thing to produce. All right, so by the mid-19th century, they had pretty much perfected the glass pressing process, and they could move away from the lacy design of glass and introduce these much bolder patterns with open panes that showed both their superior quality of glass and their color. So the color formulas were a very highly guarded secret because it took a lot of experimentation to perfect the formulas. It's a lot of chemistry that I don't quite understand. I was an art history student, but I'll point out a couple. The blue is called cobalt blue because it's made with cobalt. The electric blue and the greens are usually irons and cobalts. A lot of the yellow glass is uranium glass, which we now know is not cool. The opalescent glass, the kind of, it's also called clam broth, I believe, is uses bone ash, interestingly enough. So this is kind of my favorite display, but it shows the variety of wares that they made and the variety of colors that they produced. These are the most common colors. So again, it was still a pretty expensive process to have these new molds made. So they were still very creative with how they used them. All of these pieces are pressed in multiple parts, and that allowed them to mix and match like the top part and the base. So you get more variety that way. And then again, they would still work the pieces while they were still hot to form different shapes. So up top, that's all the loop pattern, but there's a lamp because they closed the top in, or they twisted it and flared the lip and that becomes a vase, or they added nice little crimps and it's a different style vase. Down below, it gets a little cut off, but there's a covered bowl, which is this flipped over with a little handle added. So they were good with how they used their molds. Another really popular product that they made was candlesticks. The need for lighting was constant, but I like to point out this candlestick over here because that shows even better how the pieces were pressed in two parts, and then you could mix and match colors and shapes and that kind of thing. And I don't know if you guys know the logo of the Glass Museum, but it is that little dolphin fish. So that's kind of like an iconic symbol for the Boston and Sandwich Glass Factory. But in fact, they were not the only company who made the dolphins candlesticks. Every company had their own style and their own design, but this is just what ours looked like. But it was a very popular motif that they were using in the classic revival. It was a fun thing. All right. Oh, and I just like to point this out. These are toys. So these are little glass toys. There's a quarter over here for scale. So throughout their production, they made little toys for children to have. And it's difficult to imagine giving kids now glass to play with, but they did. So some other wares that they've made were perfume bottles and cologne bottles. So as you can imagine, the hygiene practices back then were not what they were today. So cologne and perfume was great. It could hide any unpleasantness. But what I wanted to point out about these, if you look at the yellow one, you can see the finish on that is kind of odd. It's not as shiny as the other ones. It's a little sandpapery. And that's because it was a bad batch of glass or a bad batch of color, and the glass itself is starting to deteriorate. And in a couple thousand years, it will just turn to dust. It's all falling apart. So that's one of the things that they had to be very careful about, was mixing their color formulas so it was stable. So of course, this one was a failure. And if you pick it up, it's very gross to touch. And I don't think you can see, but all around it is little flakes of glass. But they would also add gilding to it as well. Just thought that was a pretty bottle. So in addition, they made like pungent bottles or little salts that tightly corseted women would carry around if they needed to be revived. But what I wanted to point out was these two labels here. So they would press all the glass bottles and then sell them to a pungent distribution center who would put their own label on it and sell them that way. They also made pomade and powder jars. And I just think these little bears are the cutest. And the products that were inside the bears was called bear grease, and it was a men's hair care product to promote growth, to cure hair loss. So I just think that's funny. All right, so we're around the 1860s now, and they start getting into these specific patterns that they would produce the entire tableware collection in. So this is called the Ashburton pattern over here. So you would press, the celery vases, the decanter, the wine goblets, egg cups, anything that you would find on the table setting they made. And that allowed people to collect their favorite pattern. The only thing that they didn't really produce was plates, like dinner plates. They might have small dishes, but they did everything else. And they did them all different colors. And this was really driven by competition from other glass factories. The middle class market is demanding more and more affordable and beautiful glassware to use. So the next big development in the glassmaking industry is the Civil War. So previous to this point, all the glass that they used is called lead glass. It uses red lead in the formula. It's also known as flint glass. So the lead was added as a softening agent, and it also helps the brightness and the clarity. But of course, with the Civil War, all of the lead is being diverted towards that war effort. And they have to come up with a new formula. It's called soda lime glass. It was developed in the Midwest. As well as the fact that a lot of companies were switching from timber as their fuel source to coal as the fuel source. And being on the Cape, they were much further removed from the actual mines. So the cost of production and their raw materials went way up, and they were no longer able to compete with the Midwestern markets who were producing this mass-produced glassware very cheaply. Oh, and this is just a lantern. It's the Lincoln and Hamlin campaign, and on the verse it says the Wide Awakes, which I guess there was a branch of in Sandwich. I think it's just a cool little lantern. So the company decides to switch gears, and they're now going to go back to the more luxury, hand-blown, finer goods and appeal to this higher market. And that involves them introducing a bunch more departments and like finishing kind of things. So for example, we have etching here, or no, this is engraving. We'll do etching next. But this is engraving. They would use a copper wheel to hand cut all of this detail in. And this is a woman, she was somebody's grandmother, I believe. But the level of detail is insane. This picture is very blown up, but the cup itself is a wine glass. It's about that big. But you can see she's working away at her sewing table. You can see some needles sticking out and a ball of yarn. So yeah, it's incredible, the amount of detail that they could capture. So they had very, very skilled artisans. And this is what the engraving wheel would have looked like. You can see there's a bunch of different heads that they use to switch out and get that detail. But I wanted to include another example. This piece was done by Eugene Perrot. He was a master engraver and glass cutter from France, from Baccarat, France. So that was one way they added a little pizzazz to their goods. And then this is etching. They used acid etching, and I kind of call this like the poor man's engraving. This was what they would do for these more mass-produced goods, like the globes that go on lamps. And the process with which they did that was applying a wax resist to the glass and then dipping it in a bath of hydrofluoric acid, which would eat away at any uncovered parts. And this is one of the areas that the women were allowed to work at. So they worked a lot in the decorating departments. So you can see them here applying some of the transfers and the wax to the globes. And it is said, this is so sad, but it said that the women who worked in the etching department would hide their hands in shame because they were so embarrassed of how the acid ate away at their nails and their hands. Dipping your hands in hydrofluoric acid for 10 hours a day can't be good for you. But another place they worked was the painting department. And so the women in the painting department, or any of the painters, were some of the most respected workers and some of the most highly paid. They were paid by the piece. So what they would do is they often painted on opaque white glass. So any white you see in the design is just the plain glass showing through. But they used enamel paints. So once they had finished their design, they would send it to the kiln to be fired and it would be fused to the glass. So it doesn't just wipe away. It's part of the object now. But a lot of the things they did were this vase over here, or lamps, they would make the shades, and then the standards around the vase, around the lamp. So I just said that the workers, they were paid by the piece. So they would cut down on time wherever they could. One really popular motif that they painted was storks, and I think that's a heron right there. But instead of drawing in all of the individual feathers, they would add a little ink to their thumb and press it in. So this is a close-up of two vases where you can kind of see thumbprints on there, fingerprints. And that was a way that they could add a whole lot of detail without a whole lot of time. So the fingerprint here and here. Just another fun fact. All right, and then they also made a lot of really wonderful sculptures. These are called éperons, they're Victorian centerpieces. So you could have flowers in the vase in the middle and your lovely little tea cakes all around. And they added a lot of etching to these, so they were as beautiful when they were not in use as they were when they were in use. And this is actually a page from a sketchbook that we have on loan to the museum from descendants of factory workers. So this was an actual factory worker's journal where he would lay out the designs and plan these wonderful sculptures. And you can kind of see in the bottom corner that there's some pricing breakdown for each individual element. A lot of these pieces were interchangeable, so you could mix and match the elements and get, whatever wonderful design you wanted. One of their most expensive, or actually their most expensive product, but one of their most wonderful and prolific, was these overlay kerosene lamps. So we have quite a collection of them here, but these were wonderful because the added layer or the added labor of making these made them able to be sold and marketed at a much higher price point. So these would be for the upper class folk. These big lamps, they're called banquet lamps, and they'd be in the Victorian parlors, and they'd have their team of help maintain them. So this is just a diagram of how the lamp is made. So it's layers of color on the glass, and then it would be sent to the cutting department, and they would very carefully cut little circles in the design to reveal the layers of color underneath. And that can be seen very clearly in here. So the base of the lamp is clear, and then it was covered with white and then covered again with red. And then the factory workers cut away to reveal the designs. In the 1870s, I would just like this picture. This guy's name is Nicholas Lutz, and he has wonderful facial hair. But he came from the Alsace-Lorraine region of France. And he brought a couple new techniques to the factory to help them expand the wares that they made. So this example here is called striped glassware. And so that was made with different canes of glass of solid color. And then they would arrange them in a pattern. So for the bottles up there, it was clear, white, blue, white, clear. And they would fuse these rods to the outside of the piece. And once they had fully melted in, you could twist them and shape them and make whatever design you wanted. Another technique that he introduced is called threaded glassware. And it gets its name from the very thin thread of glass that is applied to the exterior of the piece. So oftentimes they would add color and texture this way. So this lovely tall piece has just a very thin layer of red glass wrapped all the way around. So you can imagine you need a steady hand for that. And they also etched a lot of these pieces to even heighten the design further. And this is some examples of other wares that they made. So the one in the middle is an overlay, but it's a cologne instead of a lamp. So you can see all the intricate cuttings. The pitcher in the cup there is called overshot glass. And overshot originally was made to use up bad batches of glass. So, it had a lot of imperfections in it. It might have just been something they didn't want to commercially sell. So what they would do is they would crush up clear glass and adhere it to the outside, still in the making process, so the glass was hot. So they would roll whatever piece they were making in the crushed glass, and then they would stick it back into the furnace and it would melt slightly to the exterior. They, of course, didn't let it melt fully, so it still kept the texture. But it became such a popular product that they decided to make it with also without the bad glass. So it became a whole production line. I don't know if you guys have ever been to the museum and seen some of our demonstrations, but the way that they add color now is called frit. It's crushed up, the very densely colored glass, and it's the same process. You use clear glass, roll it in the frit, and then melt it to the outside. So it seems like the piece is colored all the way through, but it's not actually. So very similar process. And then this piece over here is called mercury glass. This is a spooner, it'd be like a spoon rest kind of thing. But the way that they made their mercury glass was a double-walled vessel. So the inside of this piece is completely hollow, and there was a little hole in the bottom that they would pour silver nitrate in, and that would coat the glass and give it that lovely mirror finish. And then they'd cork it. But it was called mercury glass because I thought it was mercury, but it's silver nitrate. And this is what the cutting department would look like. This gentleman, I believe his name is John Jones. But so they worked in an assembly line fashion. So the first person had the coarsest and the roughest wheel, and then they would make the deep cuts and just kind of lay out the design, and it'd be passed to their neighbor, and then keep going on the assembly line in that fashion until they had come to a high polish. And so this is an unfinished piece here with just those first deep rough cuts in there. And you can hopefully see that there's some remnants of red wax markings on there, and that's how they would transfer the design. So this is an image of someone actually painting on the red wax to transfer the design before it was set to be cut. But of course, this piece was never finished, so fortunately, it still has some of the wax on it. And that's a modern crayon that I just put next to it for a photo op. And this again shows the different steps. So now we're in like the 1870s, 1880s. And their effort to increase production was, and compete with the middle class or the Midwestern companies, was very successful. At their largest point, they employed 500 men, women, and boys. The boys were usually the apprentices, and the women, like I said, often worked in the decorating department. But unfortunately, around the 1880s, there was a lot of really aggressive labor unions for the glass workers. And in 1887, the Flint glass workers called for a national strike, and all the Boston and Sandwich employees joined in sympathy. So that shut down production for a long time. I think they went on strike in December of 1887, and by a few months into 1888, they still had not reopened the factory, and they were losing money every single day. And in it was August of 1888, the board of directors voted to shut down the company and sell all of the assets. So, of course, that leaves a whole village of very highly skilled and very specifically skilled laborers in Sandwich that are now out of a job. So a lot of them left in search of work, which was devastating to the local economy. But some stayed in town and they started their own businesses. So that was mostly like the decorating people. So this is Nehemiah Packwood and his partner, and they opened a glass cutting shop in town that was in operation, I think, until the early 1900s. But that was very successful for them. They would buy glass blanks and cut them and sell them themselves. That was one way that they stayed afloat. But the factory, so the Boston and Sandwich Glass Factory, the first one, it closed in 1888. There was a couple of attempts to reestablish glassmaking at the factory, the last of which was in 1907, and that was this really beautiful glass over at the end here. It's called Trevaz glassware, and it was made by the Alton Manufacturing Company. Unfortunately, the owner, his name was Dr. Flowers. He was quite corrupt, and the business very quickly ran out of money and shut down. So they were only in production for a couple of months. So that was 1908. That's when we say the final fires were put out at the factory, and the factory itself was torn down, as you can see, in the 1920s. So this is in stages of ruin, and it's being torn down. So today, this is pretty much all that's left. It used to be a popular pastime to go in the marshes where the glass factory used to be and collect fragments of glass that had been discarded. Unfortunately, now there is no access, but yeah, we have like, I think 2 tons of fragments at the factory. So if you're ever curious, come take a look. And so this is where we are now. So the Sandwich Historical Society was founded in 1907, and it wasn't until 1925 that we had our first glass exhibit, and that was commemorating the 100th anniversary of the factory. But now we're a full-fledged museum, and we like to say that we relit the fires in Sandwich, but if you're familiar with the town, you know that there's a lot of artisans and glassblowers who are still living and working there. So the glass tradition never left. Its impact on the town has been felt for these 200 years. So there's a lot of local glassblowers, but that's it for my presentation.